Today's video has been sponsored by BenQ. If you've been in the proximity of any Final Fantasy discussion, you've more than likely at least once heard of the golden age of Final Fantasy, an age in which each Final Fantasy was of remarkably high quality. From person to person, this golden era tends to range, but most commonly it refers to Final Fantasy 4 through 10, and usually includes Final Fantasy Tactics due to its exceedingly high quality narrative, though for some it includes Final Fantasy 11 and 12 as well. Though the point is, there is strong consensus that Final Fantasy games released in this era were of a remarkably high quality, and equally important, at a high frequency, like the high frequency of you who should hit the subscribe button, so we can reach our goal of 90k by the end of the year. But during this era, we received a brand new Final Fantasy game either yearly or bi-yearly. For example, Final Fantasy VII released in 1997, only so that we can get Final Fantasy VIII in 1999, and then Final Fantasy IX in 2000, and then Final Fantasy X in 2001. Oh, and then Final Fantasy XI in 2002. All of this is to say that from 1997 to 2002, we only went 1 year without a mainline Final Fantasy title. These are some of the most beloved games of all time, and that's how frequently Squaresoft was releasing these titles. But I think what puts all of this into perspective the most is that from 1987 to 2002, 15 years, there were 11 mainline Final Fantasy titles, and in the past 20 years, we've only received just 4 numbered titles: 12, 13, 14, and 15, and 5 if you were to count Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is a massive drop-off, and there are big reasons for it. And of course, the one that should immediately jump to everyone's mind is that games take tremendously more time to make than they used to. Yoshinori Kitase has explained exactly why this is the case. He was asked, quote, "Do you ever look back in amazement on how quickly Final Fantasy games are released? Between 1999 and 2003, a new Final Fantasy game came out each year. 8, 9, 10, 11, 10-2. How did that happen?" To which he responded, quote, "Yes, I am truly surprised that we finished developing a game in 1 year with a team of less than 100 people. It is most likely impossible to shorten the development time of any game at the same volume as Final Fantasy that much nowadays, no matter how many people you place on that project. It is a production flow that we can no longer return to as we now create 3D CG games, which utilize a production process that is as massive and sophisticated as film production. As such, we need much more time during the early design phases of the project. Back then, there were times when we started to develop and we hadn't even fully fleshed out the game design. For instance, the scenario for the world after the catastrophe in Final Fantasy VI was not ready even when we had already progressed quite a bit into the development of the game. No longer are the days when you can quickly put these games out. You are also unable to revise the scenario of a game and change elements of the game as fluently and frequently as you used to. Couple this with numerous production issues that plagued Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, Final Fantasy XV, as well as the hiring and firing of CyberConnect 2 during Final Fantasy VII Remake's development, and you quickly realize that holy shit, every modern mainline title has had massive issues that delayed it during its development. Even Final Fantasy XVI, which seems to be having a mostly smooth development comparatively, still ended up suffering a delay due to outsourced partners failing to deliver content on time due to the pandemic. So I can only conclude one thing: Square Enix is absolutely cursed by the most unholy of dark magic. And with that, I think it's important to acknowledge the age that came after the Golden Age. And I can only think to call this the Final Fantasy Dark Age. Calling this the Dark Age, though, extends far beyond just personal opinion. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was the first Final Fantasy title so poorly received that the company actually had to apologize for it. Seriously, imagine having to apologize for releasing a game. I can think of a couple other games they should apologize for, but that's not the point. Final Fantasy XIII was also met with a ton of poor fan reception, and while I enjoy enjoyed Final Fantasy XIII too, the trilogy would go on to dwindle in sales and fan reception, with the final game barely scratching 1 million in sales, after the original Final Fantasy XIII sold over 6 million at the time. To say this is a drop-off in interest is an understatement. Not to mention the biggest blow to the series that would see me creating this channel in the first place. The cancellation and silence of Final Fantasy Versus 13 was also pretty damaging. With the game being trapped in development purgatory, no one had seen or heard anything of it substantially for a long time, leading people to wonder, where is Final Fantasy Versus 13? Of course, the game would then resurface as Final Fantasy 15, a game that would unfortunately go on to have somewhat mixed reception among fans, many of them claiming that the story felt incomplete and that the game ultimately felt rushed. And coming off of the reception of Final Fantasy XIII, this wasn't the reception that Square Enix needed. However, after 2 decades of ups and downs, I feel that Square Enix is finally getting their bearings back. As I mentioned previously, the Golden Age was a function of 2 variables, quality and frequency. Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade received tremendous praise, and currently sits at an 89 Metascore, and has received incredible fan reception. While I do have some mixed thoughts on the first game's story direction and where its future may lie, I cannot deny that the first entry is a quality video game, and one that I thoroughly enjoyed playing, and then replaying again on hard mode. The series has a lot going for it. There's also the release of titles such as Ever Crisis that are likely to make the Final Fantasy VII brand even more popular than it is now. Speaking of 7, the original game was one that I valued as my favorite game in the entire series, and I thought the most any new Final Fantasy could ever do was be within striking range, and even that oftentimes felt like somewhat of a stretch. That is until I played Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, and I'm not the only one who feels this way. Most online games after nearing a decade in age are only being supported by a core audience, with casual players having long since left. But what's happening with Final Fantasy XIV is the absolute opposite of everything that happens traditionally with an online game's player base. It is absolutely exploding more than ever. So much so that within the past year, they had to remove the game from sales twice. Once because they literally ran out of digital codes and had to generate more of them. The second time was because the game was selling so much that the servers could not support any new players without exploding. It is also generally acclaimed as one of the best games in the franchise, if not the best. The game is also receiving a graphical overhaul by next expansion, as well as new support for the trust system, allowing players to solo most of the game's story, playing it as though it was a single-player game. Then there's the next numbered entry in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy XVI, which is being done by the same internal studio that handles 14, Creative Business Unit 3. While this game suffered a delay due to outsourced partners not being able to deliver their assets on time, which was of course due to the pandemic, it's still expected to come out relatively soon, by some estimates even as early as this year, which brings me back to the point of frequency. With Final Fantasy XIV releasing an expansion every 2 years, Final Fantasy XVI releasing between Endwalker and 7.0, and Final Fantasy VII Remake following up immediately after that, we could have a mainline Final Fantasy release every year for the next few years, which is insane and something we haven't had since the PS1 era. Then when you factor in spin-off titles into the equation, this gets even better. While I have my gripes with Stranger of Paradise's characters and story presentation, what I cannot deny is that having played both demos, Team Ninja is creating something incredibly solid here, something that I know I'm going to thoroughly enjoy, even if I roll my eyes at some of the cutscenes. I honestly think Stranger of Paradise is going to be a low-key banger, not to mention rumored titles such as Final Fantasy Tactics Remastered, which is more than likely real at this point given the state of the Nvidia leak. Look, it is no secret that Final Fantasy has had its ups and downs over the years, but I feel like I can finally say with some degree of confidence that it feels like Final Fantasy is back. And when you factor in games that aren't just Final Fantasy, it's really a new era for Square Enix as a whole. Dragon Quest XI and Nier Automata are proof of that. I can finally say, with conviction, I'm excited about Final Fantasy again. And thus we enter not what I would call the second golden age, Age, but indeed the Silver Age of Final Fantasy. And now a word from our sponsor, BenQ. If you grew up as a console gamer like me, you've always enjoyed playing games on the big screen. But what if the big screen could be even bigger? With the BenQ X3000i projector, this becomes a reality. Setting the projector up in my home theater room, I was able to use it on my 150-inch screen. And the result is one of the most cinematic ways to experience a game that I've ever seen. I know what you may be thinking. Night Sky Prince, gaming on a projector isn't going to be as high quality as on a TV. And before witnessing the prowess of the X3000i, I would have agreed. It's rare that a projector can so effortlessly compete with a TV image's sharpness and responsiveness in the way that the X3000i can. But the quality of image you see during gameplay and cinematics is absolutely crisp and vibrant. You can comfortably play through the most intense of action games like Final Fantasy VII Remake on hard mode with ease, as the ultra-fast 4-millisecond low latency brings you a rapid response and ensures that you'll never miss an opportunity to parry. And the incredible detail you'll get with the impressive true 4K resolution, with 8.3 million distinctive pixels, augmented by HDR10, it'll have you counting every single hair on Cloud's pretty little head. With 100% DCI-P3, it'll give you a brand new visual feast when looking at your favorite games. Add that with a refresh rate of up to 240 Hz and your games will look silky smooth. There are also presets for FPS, RPGs, and sports games. The X3000i is also absolutely stunning for open world games. Taking already beautiful games like Horizon Forbidden West will turn them into a travel simulator. HDR Pro and dynamic black technology delivers vivid contrast and realistic shadows, even in the dark splendor of the scenery, as its algorithm optimizes light power and adjusts appropriate brightness shown on the screen to reveal fine points in blackness. Both bright and dark elements of landscape will come to life before your eyes. There are times when playing on this thing, I just can't help but stop and look around the entire world of the game, and practically feel like I'm part of the game's world. And it truly does immerse you in the world of those games, all without having to sacrifice what you get from playing on a television. This is easily the most cinematic and immersive way I have ever experienced gaming, and it truly is something you have to see with your own eyes. Be sure to use discount code 10NightSkyPrince to get an exclusive 10% off, available until March 31st. Link in the description below.